All right, let's dive into one of those questions that comes up all the time when you're reading the Bible. It feels like this massive plot hole right at the very beginning of the story. You know the one I'm talking about. And honestly, it's a real head-scratcher. But stick with me because the answer is way more fascinating than you might think. And here it is, the big one. Who did Cain marry? I mean, think about it. Genesis tells us he's exiled for murdering his brother Abel. And then, boom, he finds a wife. But wait a second. Where on earth did she come from?
And yeah, that's the paradox that trips everybody up, right? Because if you do the math, the only people on the planet are supposed to be Adam, Eve, and Cain. So who's left? It feels like a total riddle. But what's so cool is that all the clues we need to solve it, they're actually hiding in plain sight, right there in the text.
Okay, so let's do this. Let's treat this like a genuine detective case. Put on your investigator hat, because we're about to go through the evidence, piece by piece, and see if we can crack this thing wide open. Now, the key here, and this is super important, is that we can't just skim the text. The answer isn't buried in some lost ancient scroll or anything like that. Nope, it's right there in the book of Genesis. We have to learn how to read it like an investigator, knowing exactly what to look for.
All right, so where do we even start? Well, the entire problem, this whole paradox, it really comes down to one single massive assumption that almost all of us make when we read this story. And it's all about the timeline.
See, we tend to read Genesis chapter 4 like it's a modern movie script, you know? Scene 1, then scene 2, then scene 3, all happening back to back. But that's just not how it's written. Scholars have a term for it. They call it thematic history. And what that means is that the author is compressing huge chunks of time. We're talking decades, maybe even more than a century, into one tight, focused story. And the Bible actually tells us this itself. If you just flick over to the very next chapter, Genesis 5, it says that Adam and Eve didn't stop at Cain, Abel, and Seth. Not at all. It says they had other sons and daughters, a whole bunch of them. The family was getting bigger, and a lot of time was going by. So, okay. Keeping that expanded timeline in our heads, let's go back and look for clues inside Cain's own story that actually hint at this bigger population. And here it is, Exhibit A. This comes from Cain himself. After God lays down the curse, Cain totally panics. He cries out in fear. And think about it, he's definitely not afraid of his mom and dad. He's afraid of somebody else. So you gotta ask, who is this anyone he's talking about? If the only other people around are Adam and Eve, his fear makes zero sense. He has to be talking about other people, right? His fear is a massive clue. It only makes sense if a good amount of time has passed. It implies there are other people around, a growing family of his own brothers and sisters, and maybe even their kids, his nieces and nephews. Those are the people who would have a reason to want revenge for what he did to Abel. Okay, but what about the land of Nod? A lot of people get stuck here. They think Cain just wandered off and stumbled upon another country full of people. But here's the thing. In the original Hebrew, the word Nod isn't a place name like, Canada or Egypt. It literally means wandering. It's describing his condition, a life of exile and restlessness. He didn't find a new country. He entered a new state of being. So let's recap. We've totally reframed the timeline, and we've debunked that old myth about the land of Nod. I think we finally have all the pieces of the puzzle to answer the big question. When you put it all together, the fact that Adam and Eve had lots of other kids over a long period of time, the most logical and direct conclusion from the text itself is Cain married one of his relatives. It would have been a sister or maybe even a niece.
And look, the next question that always pops up is, wait, wasn't that wrong? And that's a fair question for us today. But in that specific, unique moment in history, the answer was no. The laws against that sort of thing in Leviticus, they came way, way later. Back then, it was just a biological necessity to populate the Earth. Plus, the human gene pool was basically perfect at that point, without all the genetic problems that make it so dangerous now. But honestly, this is where things get really interesting. Because solving the who is, well, it's just a fun logic puzzle. The real story, the reason the biblical author zooms in on these details, is to get us to a much, much deeper question. Why?
I mean, why does the Bible just skip over all those other sons and daughters we talked about? Why does it go straight from Cain's story to Seth's? It's because this narrative was never really just about a family tree. It's about setting up two completely different spiritual paths, two legacies.
Think about what Eve says when Seth is born. She says God has appointed him as a replacement for Abel, the faithful son that Cain killed. So Seth isn't just another kid.
He represents the continuation of that spiritual line of faithfulness, the one that was violently cut short by Cain.
So what the Bible is doing here is laying out two totally different ways to live. You've got the way of Cain, that's the path of rebellion, of self-will, of building a city through your own human effort to make a name for yourself. And then you've got the way of Seth. That's the path of faithfulness, of worship, of building a legacy not on your own strength, but by calling on God.
So you see, the whole question about Cain's wife, that's really just the doorway into the real story. The ultimate point isn't about solving a family tree puzzle. It's about understanding this foundational choice for all of humanity, these two competing ways to live. And these two paths are still very much with us today.
And that brings it all back to us, doesn't it? It leaves us with a pretty challenging question. And it's not about your family tree, it's about your spiritual life. Which lineage are you living from? Are you building your life on your own strength and for your own name, the way of Cain? Or are you anchored in something bigger than yourself, calling on God, the way of Seth? The story basically lays out the choice and asks, which one is yours?